Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we are finishing chapter 5. I know it's been a quick unit, but we got some things to do and stuff to move on to. So let's get it started. This one is actually a shorter PowerPoint, shorter Google Slides presentation. So hopefully it's not too long. All right, so looking at the last of the progressive presidents, Woodrow Wilson, the Wilson years, chapter 5, lesson 3. That was your warm-up. Objectives, we're going to understand the differences between the three progressive presidents. We're going to critique Wilson's reforms, and we're going to analyze the shortcomings of progressivism and why African Americans weren't necessarily included in those reforms. So the 1912 election, juicy details. The 1912 presidential campaign featured the current president, a former president, and an academic who entered politics only 2 years before. Believing that Taft failed to live up to expectations, Teddy Roosevelt informed 7 state governors that he was willing to accept the Republican nomination. Control of the party will reach its breaking point at the National Convention in Chicago in 1912. Conservatives will rally behind incumbent President Taft. Progressives will support Roosevelt. When it became clear that Taft's delegates controlled the convention, Teddy Roosevelt withdrew from the party to campaign as an independent. Declaring himself fit as a bull moose, Teddy Roosevelt became a presidential candidate for the newly formed Progressive Party, which quickly got the name Bull Moose Party. Taft alienated so many groups, and this election was between two progressives, Roosevelt and Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt accepted that large trusts as a fact of life and set out to create proposals to increase regulation. He favored laws to protect women and children in the workforce and supported workers' compensation for those injured on the job. His platform was called New Nationalism. Wilson countered, calling his program New Freedom. Woodrow Wilson criticized Teddy Roosevelt's programs for supporting a regulated monopoly. He argued that Teddy Roosevelt's approach gave federal government too much power in the economy and did nothing to restore competition. And that's one thing all progressives wanted, was competition. So he believed freedom outweighed the efficiency. So as expected, Teddy Roosevelt and Taft will split the Republican votes, and Woodrow Wilson will win the Electoral College EC with 435 votes, despite only getting 42% of the popular vote. So now this is the first time that since Grover Cleveland in 1892 that a Democrat was back in office. So here's Woodrow Wilson on the left. He was New Jersey governor at the time of the presidential campaign. And here you have Roosevelt and Taft. They almost look related. And here you have the Republican Taft, Bull Moose, Teddy, and Woodrow Wilson just walking by. All right, taxes. Article 11 or Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution says representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which should be included within this union according to their respective numbers. A direct tax is a tax imposed directly on a person or property. So if the federal government wants to tax property, it has to make sure that the tax is proportionate among the states based on their population. So if a state has 20% of the population in the country, like say New York or California, it has to pay 20% of the taxes, regardless of whether the state is poor or wealthy. This will make it very difficult for Congress to pass direct taxes because it's in the Constitution, right? You would need an amendment. An indirect tax is a tax that someone pays, but the tax burden falls on someone else. If a company pays a tax for each car it makes, it simply includes that tax in the price of the car. The person who really pays for that tax is the consumer, but they pay for it indirectly. Things like sales taxes, excise taxes, and tariffs are all examples of indirect taxes. So, an income tax on wages is a form of an indirect tax, and that burden would fall on the owner. Employers knew workers would have to pay income taxes, so they have to pay high enough wages that workers will still want to take a job, knowing that they have to still pay income taxes. If there are no income taxes, employers could pay workers less and still get them to take the job. So, up until the early 1900s, the federal government had raised most of the money by using sales taxes, excise taxes, and tariffs. So, as the progressive movement began, many progressives began to argue that income taxes were the best way to fund the federal government. An income tax could be graduated, meaning it has different steps. You could tax the wealthy at a higher percentage than the poor people, obvi. And a graduated income tax is sometimes called a progressive tax. 16th Amendment, test question. In 1894, Congress imposed income taxes on wealthy Americans. The following year, the Supreme Court struck it down because they said that this tax law was not just a tax on wages, but a tax on all types of income. So if a person earned income because they rented property or because they owned stocks that paid dividends, they still had to pay the income tax. The Supreme Court ruled that an income tax should be included from income from the property was a direct tax, not an indirect tax. And since it had not been divided proportionally among the states, it was unconstitutional. So much hoopla for such a simple difference. So the Supreme Court's decision frustrated many progressives. It meant that income taxes could be put on wages, but the burden of it would fall on the working class. But the rich who earn most of their income from property could not be taxed from that income. Afterwards, progressives began pressing for a constitutional amendment that would allow the federal government to tax income, no matter its source, and without having to divide it proportionally between the states. So both Teddy Roosevelt and Taft supported this amendment, as did many political leaders in both parties. So this 16th Amendment was passed, allowing taxes on income. So income tax, federal income tax is passed. That's the 16th Amendment. So we've talked a lot about different amendments, 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendment, all going to be on your test. 2 months later, 5 weeks after taking office, Woodrow Wilson appeared before Congress. The first president, I cannot stress this enough, the first president to do so since John Adams. John Adams? Wait. That was the second president. So you're telling me for over 100 years, no president has spoken before Congress? That's crazy. He had come to present his bill to reduce tariffs and introduce a federal income tax. Wilson personally lobbied members of Congress to support this tariff. Not even Teddy Roosevelt took such an active role in promoting legislation. So in 1913, Congress passed the Revenue Act, which reduced the average tariff on imported goods by about 30% of the value of the goods and provided for a levying of a federal graduated income tax. This tax was intended to replace the revenue lost by tariff reductions. Remember, tariffs are taxes on imports. So there's Wilson giving his speech. And here's a Woodrow Wilson political cartoon. Love me some political cartoons. Okay, the double-edged sword. The United States had not had a central bank since the 1830s. Periodic economic depressions that had occurred after that time had destroyed numerous small banks, wiping out many of their customers' life savings. People didn't trust banks. Wonder why. To restore public confidence in the banking system, Woodrow Wilson supported a Federal Reserve System. Banks would have to keep part of their deposits in one of the 12 banks 12 regional banks, providing a cushion against unexpected financial losses. So you have the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, created the regional reserve banks supervised by a board of governors appointed by the president. The board could set interest rates the reserve banks charged other banks, thereby indirectly controlling the nation's interest rates and the amount of money in circulation. The Federal Reserve Act became one of the most significant pieces of legislation in U.S. history. It created an independent agency that began to use monetary policy to manage the nation's economy. Monetary policy refers to the policies that adjust the nation's money supply in order to regulate the economy. So, if the Federal Reserve, sets interest rates low, businesses and individuals will generally borrow more money. If interest rates are low, I'll take that mortgage for $500,000 on my expensive house, right? By doing this, this increases the amount of money in circulation and causes the economy to grow. If interest rates are raised, people borrow less, kind of like in today's housing market, which actually slows the economy down, but at the same time, it reduces inflation. Generally speaking, the goal of monetary policy is to contract the money supply if inflation is too high and expand the money supply if the economy is in a recession and unemployment is too high. So really, who could get us all out of this is the Federal Reserve. I remember one time in college, one of my economics professors said that with all this recession and it wasn't a depression, obviously, but the recession in 2008, 2010, he basically said the Federal Reserve has the power to just eliminate that. The Federal Reserve has enough power to eliminate student debt. They just won't, because it'll ruin the economy. So, double-edged sword. So you have here's a map of the 12 reserve banks. So the West Coast is in San Francisco. You have the other ones in Dallas, Kansas City, Minneapolis, Chicago, St. Louis, Atlanta, Richmond, Cleveland, Philly, New York, Boston. I believe that's 12. And here's an anti-Federal Reserve Bank interest charge every second all day. Maybe that will help you folks to see the truth. More antitrust stuff. So not only is it, Teddy Roosevelt going against trust and Taft going against trust, so did Woodrow Wilson. During his campaign, Woodrow Wilson promised to restore competition by breaking up monopolies. After the election, he realized that Teddy Roosevelt was right. Big businesses were actually more efficient and unlikely to be replaced by smaller, more competitive firms. Wilson also decided against pursuing monopolies. Progressives in Congress, however, continued to demand action against big business. 1914, at Wilson's request, Congress created the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, to monitor American business. The FTC has the power to investigate companies and issue cease and desist orders against those found to be engaging in unfair trade practices. If a business disagreed with their findings, they could take the FTC to court. Wilson did not want the FTC to break up big business. Instead, he wanted to work to limiting unfair trade practices. So he will deliberately appoint conservative business leaders as the FTC's first commissioners. Not progressives, conservatives. Again, that name, conservative, conserve, don't want change. Unsatisfied by Woodrow Wilson's approach, WW, progressives in Congress passed the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914. Test question: this outlawed certain practices that restricted competition, such as price discrimination, charging different people different rates. So the passing of the Clayton Antitrust Act corrected deficiencies from the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. And whereas the Sherman Antitrust Act wasn't real, it's in its name, antitrust. It wasn't really used to break up trust. It was actually used to break up unions. The Clayton Antitrust Act is actually the law that goes against antitrusts, anti-monopolies, and tries to break those up. So while the Sherman Antitrust Act gets the name from it, it's the Clayton Antitrust Act that is more significant. So before this law was passed, labor unions also began to lobby Congress to be exempt because, again, the Sherman Antitrust Act tried to get rid of unions. So unions wanted to lobby Congress members to be like, hey, let us be exempt. As a result, the Clayton Antitrust Act stated that its provisions did not apply to labor or agricultural organizations. When the bill became law, Samuel Gompers, remember that name, called the act the workers' Magna Carta because it gave unions the right to exist. Thank you. So here's the FTC, Clayton Antitrust Law. It looks a little bit like Towley. Funny. No mas. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson signed the first federal law regulating child labor. The Keaton-Owing Child Labor Act prohibited the employment of children under the age of 14 in factories producing goods for interstate commerce. Although the Supreme Court declared this law unconstitutional in 1918, Woodrow Wilson's effort helped his reputation among progressives. He supported the Adamson Act, which established the 8-hour workday for railroad workers. He also supported the Federal Farm Loan Act, which helped provide low-interest loans to farmers. Fix it. Progressivism made the important changes in the political life of the United States. Before this era, most Americans did not expect the government to pass laws protecting workers or regulating big business. In fact, many courts had ruled the passage of such laws unconstitutional. But by the end of the progressive era, both legal and public opinion shifted. Increasingly more Americans expected the government, particularly the federal government, to play a more active role in regulating the economy and solving social problems. Progress limited, however. The most conspicuous limit of progressivism was its failure to address racial and religious discrimination. African Americans were absorbing the reform spirit, which fueled their longstanding desire for advancement. W.B. Du Bois and 28 other African Americans met in Niagara Falls to demand full rights for African Americans, called the Niagara Movement. Du Bois believed that voting rights were essential to end lynching and racial discrimination. Thus, the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was born in 1909. Through Du Bois, members learned the Niagara Movement and the two groups will merge. African Americans weren't the only minority groups discriminated against. Jewish people lived in fear of mob violence. In 1913, Leo Frank was tried in Atlanta for a murder that the facts proved that he did not commit, and he was still convicted and sentenced to death. Although this sentence would be changed to life imprisonment, a mob lynched him 2 years later. In this context, lawyer Sigmund Livingston started the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, to combat stereotypes and discrimination. The ADL's ultimate purpose was to secure justice and fair treatment of all citizens alike and put an end to unfair and unjust discrimination against those and ridicule of any sect or body of citizens. Whew, that was a lot. NAACP on the that's W.B. Du Bois later in life. Here's the NAACP logo. Here's a picture in front of Niagara Falls, New York. And we are done. Wow, we zoomed through that. So hopefully you guys did enjoy. Again, hold that thought. One moment, please. Hold on. All right. So your homework is to be completed page 239, 2 through 4. That's 239, 2 through 4. So that concludes progressivism, the progressive movement, the change, the shift that Teddy Roosevelt did for the presidency, all the different aspects, child labor, big business, working conditions, unions. It's crazy. All the amendments, women's suffrage, initiative, recall, referendum, big ideas, big ideas. So hopefully you guys did enjoy. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.